Hi there, and welcome to Voices and the Votes, a special program of dialogue on China's annual two sessions, or Lianghui. China's Chief Justice and Procurator-General delivered their annual reports today, demonstrating the work of China's judicial staff in the passing year. How has China's judicial system progressed in a fast-changing nation? And what will their focus be in the coming year? To take a closer look at those two annual reports, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Tao Jingzhou, Managing Partner of the Kurt LLP China. He's also the only China-based lawyer nominated as a member of the International Commercial Expert Committee of the Chinese Supreme People's Court, and Mr. Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee & Xu. We shall also speak to Victor Gao Zhikai on the phone. He is the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. Observers, Chinese and foreign alike, must follow the Lianghui very closely. It's an annual political season, very important. And one of the most important things that merit the attention of those observers must be the two reports by the highest court and the highest judicial, the procuratory institution. So what are the most interesting and impressive points that you can acquire and take from the two reports?
For me, when I look at the Supreme Court report, I think there are three things caught my attention. First one is Supreme Court last year has handled more than 36,000 cases.
That's a lot.
That's a lot for our Supreme Court, because when you check any other Supreme Court in the world, you never have such kind of caseload. That means that each judge in the Supreme Court roughly handle from 80 to 100 cases per year. So it's kind of busy for Supreme Court judge.
Well, that's their duty, to be busy, to be kept busy.
Right, yeah.
Given the sizable population of our country.
Right, yeah. And the second one is also Supreme Court handled, and also other courts handled, over 15,000 foreign-related commercial litigation. When you know that normally all the commercial dispute among Chinese and foreign companies are subjected to arbitration, and 15,000 cases handled by Chinese court is also a big number. And the third one, I think the most important one, is the enforcement of judgment. You know, for the last years, a lot of people complained, saying that it's always good to get a judgment, but if we cannot get enforced, it's worth nothing. For the last 3 years or so, Supreme Court, made a lot of effort try to enforce the judgment of the court. I have this statistic. For the last 3 years, there are 20 million cases about the enforcement of the judgment. So also, this last 3 years, they have enforced roughly 4.4 trillion renminbi, equal to $650 billion. So that's a really big amount. Unbelievable. So those three things, I think, show that the courts in China are very busy. They really try to make people respect the judgment. And I think all this is a good progress for China.
Given China's deep integration with the rest of the world over the past 4 decades, Edward, you've been here for a while, and there's obviously remarkable progress in improving rule of law. However, execution, implementation, enforcement, as Mr. Tao Jingzhou said correctly, proves to be a very important problem. It's an embarrassing problem. Why do you think the two reports emphasize overwhelmingly the importance of execution?
Well, what I like about the report from an outsider looking in is that it almost takes a STEM viewpoint, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and it looks at the the Chinese laws based on the German Code of 1896 Continental Law. And even the report today, and even with my learned friend Mr. Tao here, is, you know, we come at it with this number, 36,000 cases heard by the Supreme Court. There's almost 300 justices in the Supreme Court, which is again remarkable. And having appeared there myself on a number of occasions, you know, it's a 3-judge panel. These numbers are great. Now, you're right. What happens is the appearance that there's non-enforcement, the appearance that these things don't happen, and that's the kind of stuff that makes, quote, news, unquote, and that's where the problem comes. Now, what I see on a practical basis, and Mr. Tao does, I'm sure, at his law firm over at Deckert, is that that there's a lot of people that don't participate in the system. They say there is no justice, and as a result, they're not vying for that justice. In one particular case that I've been representing, it's been 11 years, an American NGO that's fighting for IP rights that have been stolen by a Chinese enterprise. There has been finally a judgment, and again, there's been some problem with enforcement on that judgment, but the perception, you know, it's taken some time. That isn't unusual in the United States system, but people, they harp on this idea that it takes time for enforcement. All things take time. This is a very large country. The other thing that we're confronted with is that there's only 300,000 lawyers. So you think that the type of people, like Tao Jinzhou or Victor Gao that will be on later, and myself, is that there's only 300,000 lawyers in the whole country, in a country of 1.4 billion people. In the United States, we have 1.3 million lawyers, 5 times less the population. Just the infrastructure problem of trying to confront these things is a problem for this country, and one that they're trying to solve, I should say.
The statistics you came up with are so embarrassing, and America has indeed put China to shame in terms of the number of lawyers. Let me go over to Victor Gao Zhikai. He's on the phone. Hello, Victor.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
You know, we were discussing why enforcement of the law proves so difficult in China. Your answer, please.
Yes, I think one of the highlights of the 2 reports, as you just now mentioned, is a greater emphasis on enforcement. Traditionally, there has been a lot of problems in terms of enforcement of decisions by the courts. Why? Mainly because of regionalism. Sometimes local governments are not very happy about enforcing some of the court decisions. Sometimes political intervention, for example, because in China, in addition to the legal system, the party system sometimes is also very, very important, and some people try to cut the corners and try to get around the legal system to put their influence into the judiciary process. And then there are other factors impacting on the enforcement factor. Basically, the enforcement has been a weak point in the judiciary system in China, and this year's 2 reports actually focus very much on the need to cooperate and to make sure that the court decisions will be enforced. And I think this will be very good for the legal system itself. It will be very good for all the parties involved, and it will make
Victor,
the judiciary system much more efficient going forward.
Victor, lawmaking as well as enforcement of the law are, of course, very important. But what do you think of the growing awareness on the people's side to protect their rights?
Of course, I think the greater emphasis we as a society will put on the judiciary system, the greater will be the future for China. On the other hand, in China, we also see a lot of other channels for people to air their grievances, like shangfang, or petition to the higher level of government, for example. This is outside of the judiciary system, and the reasons are plentiful. Sometimes it's because the judiciary system is very much clogged because of the overworkload, sometimes because of other factors impacting on the independence of the judiciary system, etc. And also in the minds of many people here in China, they actually prefer to petition directly to the government or to the party rather than going through the judiciary system. Why? Because once you go through the judiciary system, it's costly, it's uncertain, and there are other factors, basically.
Thank you so much, Victor.
I think, yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Jingzhou, the most alluring piece of legislation that the NPC might approve this year around will be the foreign investment law. When we look at the issue of enforcement, do you think the United States is prepared to accept the foreign investment law? And what do you think is the most important part about this piece of legislation?
Yeah, I think the foreign investment law is really a completely new piece of legislation because they merged the three existing law, joint venture law, contractor joint venture law, and a wholly foreign enterprise law. So they abolished all the administrative side for the approval process, etc., and put forward the protections, encouragement that the Chinese government will give to foreigners, and emphasize their right of doing something in China. They are to a certain degree national treatment side. So I think it should be a welcome piece for U.S. government and for all other foreign governments.
Do you think the United States can accept some of the important articles in the foreign investment law? For example, no coercive transfer of technology through the establishment of joint ventures?
Yeah, I do. I mean, that's Article 22, and that is probably the blockbuster there. Article 22 has to do with this not allowing administrative measures to be able to take intellectual property, and again, it would be reducing the restrictive levels, which require, this is where the problems occurred, where you had to have a joint venture partner. But just to be clear, I mean, the foreigners who were participating also weren't bringing in their best technology, their best and brightest technology. They were aware of the situation. But that's limiting the amount of restricted ventures, which means that they could have more wholly foreign-owned enterprises, reducing the number of negative, which are areas which are not prohibitive, and then Article 22, which talks about this intellectual property. Now, the devil is in the details, and now we know in the common law system that once the Supreme Court, which makes law, makes case law, decides that something can happen, like Miranda versus Arizona, you must read someone their rights before you arrest them or after you arrest them, or that evidence is not valid. We know that tomorrow, the next day. Okay, that must be enforced by all the police. In China, when you do have the law brought in, that's where the confusion begins, because government officials don't get any more money to interpret those, and so that takes some time. It's like turning around a ship. So that's where the challenge comes, but it's also the opportunity.
When we look at news values, we have to keep in mind the prominence.
Yeah.
Prominence means in China, of course, our great leader Xi Jinping, okay, he prioritized three things on his agenda: the prevention of systematic financial risks, second, the complete poverty alleviation by the end of next year, and of course, minimize the negative impact of environmental pollution. These are the three things that he keep in mind, and so this time around in the two reports, great emphasis is laid on how legal assistance could be provided. What have you discovered from the delivery of the two reports?
First, there are quite some prosecution of the environment law related crime. So I think it's maybe one of the first time that China really put people in jail for the environmental violation. So that's a good thing. And second one is, in order to help poor people to have access to justice, you must have a legal aid program, what we call pro bono program, so that they can get affordable lawyer or lawyer free of charge to represent those poor people to have access to the justice system. So this also reflected in Chief Justice Mr. Zhou Qiang's report.
Again, this is a matter of execution.
Yeah.
And supervision of such execution.
Exactly. And one of the things they might think about would be to take a look at the law programs. There's about 650 law programs in China now, and maybe that they can, at least in the United States, one of the things that they've done is had clinics that would allow law students to be able to provide some level of advice underneath the supervision of a lawyer, of course. I'm not suggesting that China adapts that plan, but at least with the remarks today in the report, I think this type of thing is really encouraging, that justice should have equal access. It shouldn't be how much justice can you afford. It should be about equal access for both poor and rich folks as well.
That's why you have this compulsory obligation of lawyers to have certain hour per year for pro bono work, so that they cannot get paid, but they have to perform this duty, social duty, in order to help poor people. And this also exists in other countries like in the US and in Europe.
I'm just curious, Edward and Jingzhou, about what kind of legal protection can be provided by the government and indeed by the judiciary system to ensure that no financial risks could break out systematically to really protect the well-being of the ordinary folks.
The financial risk to protect this through the judicial system is maybe difficult. I think it's a regulatory issue. First, you have to have access related requirement imposed by government, so that not everybody can get involved in the financial activities. And the second, you have to also to have enforcement and control of such activities by regulators. Only after that, if there are any breach, you should have, they should be held criminally liable and put them in jail to set up example. Like in the US,
right.
There are many leading businessmen are unfortunately in jail.
Yeah, sure.
Kind
of education
and other stuff.
Yeah, sure. No, but I mean, and I think you're absolutely right. How do we assure for that? There's that fine line between what is criminal and what is a civil matter, and China defines it. In intellectual property, for example, when intellectual property is stolen, that can also be a crime if it's over a certain level. And so, I mean, that's already been recognized in law. One can be arrested for that, and we've had clients who have been arrested and who have gone to jail because they've been found to infringe on, and we've certainly enforced it against people who've had that infringement as well. So this is this cross relationship. Sometimes the problem had been in the past is the police were reticent to get involved if it was going to be a civil case, or the civil were reticent to get involved because it was a criminal case. But now I think with the report today, it's making a clear message that this could be criminal as well as civil.
I think in China, what generates headlines these days is the protection of private assets, and that remains a major concern for the private economy. Sure. Otherwise, I mean, with the prominence of the state-owned enterprises, what about the job market, which, with the help of SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, it could provide up to 10 million, probably, jobs for the young university graduates. So what do you think of the legal protection of private assets, and how can we tell the difference and separate civil offense from criminal offense?
It's true that there are many reported cases where, private property get somewhat taken away by some, local officials and others. That happens, and but you have this legal remedy. Now, the Supreme Court said all lawsuits should be accepted by the court. In the old days, you can
be very selective.
Yeah, selective. Right. They can say, no, this I cannot accept. So I think now certain progress has been made so that those found that their right was breached can actually go to the court, either for the civil matters, right, or go to the police to report and to file a criminal case.
But not only that, exactly, what's really exciting is that the administrative law now makes those that you are suing, they must show up in court, which is something. Because, again, I think that the report and the underlying rule of law that's been happening in China now, which is exciting transformation, is that it's not only about justice being done, but it's that it just appears to be done for people, because everyone thinks that maybe this is just for rich people, or this is just for the entitled people, or big corporations, but it should have access to everyone. And then, but also to have these administrators where you may sue the government, the administrator must show up and must actually attend.
We have tons of other issues to cover, gentlemen. For example, in the area of food and drug safety, when we review what has been achieved over the past year, up to 12,360 people sued for making counterfeit drugs and poisonous food, marking an increase of 5.5% year-on-year. The emphasis will be put on public interest litigation concerning secondary and primary schools, grocery markets, and online delivery products. We have so many issues. Today, in the 21st century, what do you think of our concerns about the food and drugs? I mean, this is the bottom line, right? If you don't feel safe and secure when you eat something, when you're for ill, you take the medication, you don't have the feeling of being safe. I mean, that's like a net marriage situation.
Yeah, in that aspect, not only you need a judicial remedy, you also need to hold the local official responsible or sometimes liable for the bad thing happened.
Hold them to the account.
Yes, right. So otherwise, only through the judicial remedy is not that, timely or efficient.
But we've also, and historically, I mean, the CFDA, the head of the CFDA at one point, or the predecessor to the CFDA, I mean, was executed. I mean, there have been means, and,
right.
and the core issue here is not necessarily about those numbers, but the core issue is about, I think that Xi Jinping and the message of the folks that talk today is about made in China should be high quality. It should be a brand. It should be something that should be relied upon. And that we all see, living here in Beijing, a lot of people want to buy products from abroad because they don't trust, colloquially, they don't trust the products. And this report is trying to underscore that products made in China should be of the highest quality and around the world, and for the consumers, for the people here in China. That's
exactly. So, what do you think of the crackdown on criminal guns? Is this issue very serious? Criminal guns, mafia,
criminal gun. It's something happened already. I think 20 years ago. There are one campaign against the mafia.
Yeah, our paramount leader Deng Xiaoping launched the severe crackdown,
right.
Very pretty severe, pretty tough campaign against gangsters.
Yeah, but of course you can have this, but
mistakes.
everything needed to be under rule of law. That means due process. That means access to lawyers. That mean otherwise you may have some revenge of the people against the others. So without open justice, without a due process, you may repeat error made in the 80s. So I hope with experience learned, we will not repeat what has happened in the past.
I think something has been discussed on our program when a disaster, when a case, a so-called criminal case took place in Kunshan city in Jiangsu province. The guy who killed a villain, a bad guy, was acquitted, and that surprised the netizens in their millions in a very sweet way. What do you think of the innocence of this guy who killed someone else for self-defense?
Well, I mean, most jurisdictions recognize that. Other jurisdictions, I mean, in the United States, most people watched that were alive at the time. Ronald Reagan being shot by a fella, and he was actually found to be innocent because he didn't have the proper mental capability to do it. So self-defense is a proactive, it's a defense that could be used in law to justify a killing. And so I think it is justified. Again, the trier of fact has to make that determination. It's hard to do it on television.
The level of civility largely depends on how you treat the disadvantaged and poor people in the society. And therefore, this, look at this, paying extra attention to special groups. By special groups, we mean, for example, women's rights, disabled people's rights, delaying rural migrant workers' wages on purpose. What progress has been made in these areas?
I think in the report, they mentioned a big number that the salary which will actually get paid by all these entrepreneurs forced by the Chinese court. Chinese court actually give a injunction, order them to pay the salary, and actually they get paid before Chinese Spring Festival. There are some, bad entrepreneurs. They just delayed paying the, salary of some poor people, and those
migrant workers, for example.
Yeah, for example, so they have no means to go to the court to hire lawyers. So they only do, like Victor said, 上访, and which is not a very efficient way. So that's why I think Chinese court should have a special procedures to have quick access, so that the right of poor people can get protected. That's you call China a socialist country for.
Right, we have, injustice delayed in these cases is justice denied. And so, but again, China is the challenge because you only have 300,000 lawyers. In the United States, for example, you learn from older lawyers. Learning from people like Mr. Tao, the folks that work in his office are lucky to learn from him. But there aren't people that have the kind of decades of experience as he does, whereas there's a whole bunch of folks like that in the United States. And the practice of law is just that, the practice you learn from other people. And so I think that the challenge is how do we make this not just in Beijing and Shanghai, but all around the country, all around the world.
Recently, the conflict between Pakistan and India captured our attention. Well, the two countries have been on loggerheads for years, since the partition, with the end of the British colonial rule. But what captured my attention was the release of an Indian pilot by the Pakistani government. Now, that has a lot to do with this, how to preserve veterans' legitimate rights, including a former ex-serviceman. Legal assistance was offered in time for 122 million staff and their families to preserve, 122 military staff and their families to preserve their legitimate rights better. The Supreme People's Court vows to wholeheartedly implement the landmark law of protecting heroes and martyrs' reputation and honor, passed unanimously last April. This has been discussed extensively online, on the social media.
Sure.
Why do you think this is so important for the Chinese compared with, for example, the United States, Vietnam veteran, so on and so forth?
Yeah. In the U.S., they have a special, channel for military,
right,
and special access for,
VA
airport,
hospitals,
everything.
Yeah,
so I think all those people sacrifice their life for the safety of a country, and themselves and their family should get somewhat special treatment, so that you can encourage people.
Do you think POW should be humiliated? Prisoners of war.
Of course
this POW from India was released, and he was given a hero's welcome, a homecoming welcome, big red market ceremony, perhaps. Not bigger red carpet ceremony by Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah. No, but that to me is mercy. That to me is dignity. That's the way that people should behave, and that's the civility that should be. I look at the French Foreign Legion, for example. Mr. House, has a lot of dealings in France. They take care of this group into their old age, into their dotage, in a pension. With regards to Chinese and American veterans, for example, just so you know, we have stolen honor, and this is very good that they're recognizing these folks.
And of course, the Pakistani government deserves the credit for releasing the Indian pilot out of humanitarian reason. We have a lot of margin for improvement in this kind of case in China. Until next time. The same time for Voices and Votes on the Sidelines of Liang Hui. Until then, goodbye.